December 19th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 0547 hours. Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt stood in the frozen turret of his Panther tank, watching American positions through the morning fog. His crew was laughing. The Americans and their toy guns. His gunner muttered, pulling his collar tight against the cold. They shoot more shells than we have trees in this forest, but half of them don't even explode. Reinhardt had heard the same joke from every Wehrmacht officer since Normandy. American artillery, loud, wasteful, uncoordinated. A blunt instrument wielded by amateurs. The kind of firepower that announced itself from kilometers away, giving you time to dig in, button up, wait it out. Let them waste their factories on noise, Reinhardt said, exhaling frost. Thunder without lightning. His loader grinned and tapped the Panther's thick frontal armor. This beast laughs at their pop guns. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we uncover the stories the world forgot. What Reinhardt didn't know was that at that exact moment, 3 American forward observers were already transmitting his coordinates to a fire direction center 6 kilometers behind the front line, and that within 90 seconds, 72 howitzers from 4 separate battalions would converge their fire on a killing box no larger than a football field. A box that contained his Panther, 3 supporting half-tracks, and the better part of his confidence in German steel. The M114 155mm howitzer was not designed to impress. It looked agricultural, a split-trail carriage, a stubby barrel, a breech mechanism that could have been borrowed from a 19th century cannon. But the numbers told a different story. Maximum range, 14,300 yards. Rate of fire, 4 rounds per minute sustained, 6 in a competent crew's hands during a fire mission. Shell weight, 95 pounds. Muzzle velocity, 1,850 feet per second. The M107 high-explosive projectile it hurled contained 15 pounds of TNT equivalent, and when it detonated, the fragmentation radius stretched to 50 yards in every direction. But raw firepower was only half the equation. The real innovation was the system wrapped around it. The fire direction centers, equipped with graphical firing tables, meteorological data, and a coordination network that could bring dozens of batteries to bear on a single target in under 2 minutes. The Germans called it Führerwalls, the fire roller. The Americans called it time on target. Same effect. Different doctrine. The doctrine didn't arrive fully formed. In North Africa, American gunners had fired thousands of shells at empty desert, chasing reports of German armor that had already moved. Battery commanders operated in isolation, coordinating by radio when they could give signal, guessing at enemy positions when they couldn't. The 1st Armored Division lost 17 M7 Priest self-propelled guns in the first week at Kasserine Pass, not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdowns, communication failures, and crews that hadn't trained together long enough to load under pressure. One battery fired on its own infantry. Another shelled a hill the Germans had abandoned 6 hours earlier. The after-action reports were brutal. "We possess the guns," one division artillery officer wrote, "but we do not yet possess the orchestra." The fix came from a combination of hard math and harder experience. Forward observers, usually young lieutenants with a radio, a map, and a death wish, learned to call corrections in meters, not vague compass directions. Fire direction centers began plotting intersecting fans of fire, overlapping kill zones where shells from multiple batteries arrived simultaneously. The tactic had a musical quality. Stagger the charges, adjust the angles, time the fuses so that a dozen shells detonated within a 3-second window over the same patch of earth. General Leslie McNair, who oversaw artillery training at Fort Sill, distilled it into a single sentence that became doctrine. The purpose of artillery is not to destroy the enemy. It is to dominate the clock. The first legend came from a hillside in Sicily, July 1943. A battery of M2A1 105mm howitzers, 6 guns, dug into a terraced olive grove overlooking the coastal road to Palermo, received a fire mission at 1,420 hours. German mechanized infantry, 2 companies strong, moving in column. The forward observer, a first lieutenant named Eugene Cray, was perched in a stone farmhouse 800 yards ahead of the battery position, watching through binoculars as the German half-tracks rolled into view. His radio operator, a kid from Indiana named Decker, had the handset ready. Cray didn't waste words. Fire mission. Grid 3-7-4-2-9-5. Mechanized column in the open. 6 guns. Converge and sweep. The first shells landed long, gray fountains of rock and dust erupting 50 yards beyond the lead vehicle. Cray adjusted. Drop 200. Fire for effect. What happened next was mathematics made audible. 36 shells in 90 seconds. The M2A1 had a range of 12,000 yards and fired a 33-pound projectile at a rate that put one round down range every 15 seconds. The bursts walked through the column like a reaper through wheat. Half-tracks flipped. Trucks detonated. Men scattered into the ditches and found no cover because the next salvo was already in the air. Cray watched through the smoke as the German column disintegrated, vehicles burning, survivors stumbling back toward their own lines. His radio crackled. Target destroyed. Good effect on target. Decker looked at him, hands still shaking. Cray just nodded. That's what convergence looks like. The second vignette came 4 months later, in the mud and frozen rain of the Volturno River Valley. November 1943. A battalion of the 34th Infantry Division was pinned down by a German counterattack. 3 companies of Panzer Grenadiers, supported by dug-in MG-42 machine gun nests, and at least 2 88mm guns in direct fire rolls. The Americans were taking casualties in the open, unable to advance, unable to withdraw. The request for fire support came through at 0820 hours, and the response was immediate. 8 batteries, 48 guns total, a mix of 105mm and 155mm, were tasked. The forward observer was a captain named Robert Marsh, crouched in a drainage ditch with his radioman, close enough to the German line that he could hear their voices shouting over the machine gun fire. Marsh called the grid, called the range, and then said the words that would become a mantra in every American artillery unit for the rest of the war. Danger close. Repeat, danger close. We are inside the kill radius. Fire anyway. The first salvo landed 60 yards in front of his position, close enough that the concussion lifted him off the ground. The second salvo landed on the German line. The third turned the hillside into a churning storm of earth and shrapnel. The MG-42S went silent. The 88s stopped firing. When the infantry advanced 20 minutes later, they found the German position destroyed. Guns overturned, foxholes collapsed, bodies scattered in the craters. One survivor, a 19-year-old Gefreiter, was pulled from a bunker and interrogated by a translator. His hands were still shaking. "We were told your artillery was slow," he said. "We were told you could not coordinate. You just killed 2 platoons in 3 minutes." Then came the upgrades. The M114 howitzer, already lethal, received a new variant of high-explosive shell in late 1943. The M107, with improved fragmentation characteristics and a more reliable M54 fuse. The difference was subtle on paper, but catastrophic in practice. The older M48 fuse had a failure rate of nearly 8%. 1 in 12 shells was a dud. The M54 dropped that to under 2%. Suddenly, every salvo hit with near-total certainty. Crews began to recognize the sound difference. The M107 detonated with a sharper crack, a higher-pitched whip of overpressure that signaled better fragmentation spread. Gunners started calling them crackerjacks because of the noise. On the receiving end, German infantry learned to distinguish the sound of an incoming M107 from the older munitions, and learned that there was no point in hoping for a dud. But the real transformation came with the introduction of the SCR 610 radio set in early 1944, a frequency-modulated backpack unit that gave forward observers reliable communication even in mountainous terrain or under heavy jamming. Suddenly, artillery could follow the infantry into the worst ground, ravines, forests, urban rubble, and still coordinate fire with the rear batteries. The kill chain tightened. Call to impact, under 2 minutes. Adjust and fire for effect, under 4. A German defensive position that might have held for hours under older doctrine now had a lifespan measured in single-digit minutes. The range expansion came next, and it was as much about logistics as firepower. By the spring of 1944, American artillery battalions in Italy and France were being supplied by a network that moved over 15,000 tons of ammunition per week. 105mm shells stacked in depots, 155mm rounds transported by truck convoy, fuses and powder charges inventoried down to the individual crate. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force logged the movement of artillery shells with the same obsessive detail it tracked fuel and rations. A single division, 18,000 men, could call on the support of 72 to 96 howitzers, and those guns could sustain fire for hours without running dry. The Germans, by contrast, were rationing shells. A Wehrmacht artillery officer captured near Cannes in July 1944 told his interrogators that his battery had been limited to 12 rounds per gun per day, and that sometimes they received no resupply for a week. "You waste shells like we waste words," he said bitterly. "We cannot compete with that." He wasn't wrong. The American industrial base was producing artillery ammunition at a rate that defied comprehension. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories turned out over 60 million rounds of artillery ammunition, everything from 75mm to 240mm. That was more than Germany and Japan combined produced in the entire war. And it kept accelerating. The artillery's role began to shift. Originally tasked with supporting infantry advances and breaking up enemy concentrations, the guns were increasingly used for interdiction, cutting roads, collapsing bridges, hammering supply dumps and rail junctions deep behind the front line. The 155mm howitzer, with its extended range, became the weapon of choice for counter-battery fire. Forward observers began hunting enemy guns, directing American shells onto German artillery positions before they could displace. It became a lethal game of hide and seek, and the Americans had more players. A Wehrmacht battery that revealed its position with a single fire mission could expect American counter-battery fire within 5 minutes, and that fire wouldn't stop until the position was rubble. By mid-1944, German gunners had learned not to fire more than 2 or 3 rounds before moving. Some stopped firing altogether. The thunder belonged to America now. The respect came slowly, grudgingly, in fragments of captured correspondence and interrogation transcripts. A letter found on a German NCO killed near St. Lo in July 1944. "The American artillery is unlike anything we faced in Russia. It does not stop. It does not miss. You hear the whistle, and you know there is no time to run." Another, from a Panzer officer's diary, recovered near Falaise. "Our tanks can survive their Shermans. We cannot survive their shells." A post-war interview with General Major Fritz Behrlein, who commanded Panzer Lehr Division during the Normandy breakout, was even more direct. "The American artillery was the single most effective weapon deployed against us in France," he said. "Not the Air Force. Not the tanks. The guns. Always the guns." Japanese prisoners on Okinawa echoed the sentiment in different words. "We could fight the riflemen," one sergeant told his captors. "We could ambush the tanks. But the shells came from nowhere, and they came without end." The industrial avalanche was not a metaphor. It was a measurable, terrifying fact. In 1943, American factories produced 12,000 artillery pieces of all types. In 1944, that number climbed to over 18,000. The M114 155mm howitzer alone accounted for over 6,000 units. The M2A1 105mm, over 10,000. These were not handcrafted weapons. They were stamped, welded, machined on assembly lines that ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. A single factory in Pennsylvania could turn out 40 howitzers a week. The Rock Island Arsenal produced 1 million shells a month. Workers, many of them women, many of them working their first industrial job, assembled fuses, packed powder charges, stenciled serial numbers on shell casings. The production lines moved with the rhythm of a drumbeat, relentless and geometric. And every piece rolled off those lines with a destination: a battery in France, a battalion in Italy, a fire mission on a grid coordinate that would be called in by a lieutenant with a radio. Germany could not replace its guns. Japan could not replace its ammunition. America replaced both faster than they could be destroyed. A damaged howitzer in Normandy could be swapped out and back in action within 48 hours. A depleted ammunition depot could be resupplied in 72. The math was inevitable. The final boss wasn't a single tank or a single bunker. It was the German doctrine of elastic defense, the layered system of strongpoints and fallback positions that had bled the Allies white in Italy and stalled them in the hedgerows of Normandy. Concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. Registered artillery zones where German guns could drop shells on any approach route. Minefields covered by machine guns. It was a system designed to absorb punishment, trade space for time, and inflict maximum casualties on any attacker. And for months, it worked. American infantry took brutal losses trying to crack these positions with rifles and grenades. Tanks bogged down in narrow lanes, perfect targets for hidden 88s. But by the autumn of 1944, the American artillery had evolved a counter-doctrine that turned the German system into a death trap. It was called the serenade, though no one remembered who coined the term. The concept was simple and devastating. Isolate the strong point with smoke and high explosive, suppress every supporting position simultaneously, then walk a curtain of fire forward at exactly the pace of the infantry advance, 50 yards every 3 minutes. The Germans couldn't retreat because the shells were landing on their withdrawal routes. They couldn't call for support because their communications were cut by the same barrage. They couldn't return effective fire because the moment a gun revealed its position, it was bracketed and destroyed. The serenade turned fortified positions into coffins. The proving ground was the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, as the Germans called it, a band of fortifications stretching from the Swiss border to the Netherlands. Concrete dragon's teeth to stop tanks. Bunkers sunk deep into hillsides. Artillery observation posts with reinforced steel shutters. It was supposed to be impregnable. In October 1944, the 1st Infantry Division attacked a section of the line near Aachen with an artillery preparation that redefined the word intense. 16 battalions, 192 guns, fired a preliminary bombardment that lasted 40 minutes and expended over 18,000 rounds. The forward observers coordinated the fire so precisely that each bunker received individual attention. Armor-piercing shells to crack the concrete, high explosive to collapse the interior, white phosphorus to burn out any survivors. One German defender, captured in the rubble of his position, told interrogators he had been in the bunker for 6 months and believed it could withstand anything. "We had 3 feet of reinforced concrete above us," he said. "We had ammunition for 2 weeks. We had orders to hold until relieved." He paused, looking at his hands. "Your shells hit us for 15 minutes. 15 minutes. The walls cracked. The ceiling came down. The air caught fire. We surrendered because we could not breathe." The 1st Division broke through the West Wall in 72 hours. A section that German planners had estimated would hold for 2 weeks minimum. The Wehrmacht tried to adapt. They dispersed their positions, dug deeper, moved at night. But the American artillery adapted faster. By January 1945, fire direction centers were using early IBM calculating machines, mechanical computers the size of desks, to process firing solutions in seconds rather than minutes. Meteorological stations tracked wind speed, air density, temperature gradients, and fed the data directly to the gunners. The result was accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. A target identified at dawn could be engaged before the enemy had time to move. A German officer captured during the Colmar Pocket Offensive said his unit had relocated a mortar position 3 times in one night, and each time, American shells found them within minutes of the first shot. "It was as if you could see through the dark," he said. "As if God himself was calling the coordinates." Then came the Ardennes counteroffensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble. The Operation Reinhardt and 10,000 men like him believed would split the Allied armies and turn the tide. December 16, 1944. Fog, snow, and silence. Then the eruption of German armor through the forested hills. For 72 hours, it looked like it might work. American units were overrun, supply lines cut, entire battalions encircled. But the weather cleared on December 23rd, and with it came the full weight of American fire coordination. Over 400 artillery battalions were repositioned and brought to bear on the salient. The numbers defied belief. On December 24th alone, American guns fired over 250,000 rounds, more shells in one day than the entire German artillery reserve had stockpiled for the offensive. The forward observers, operating in sub-zero temperatures with radios that barely functioned in the cold, walked fire missions onto every road, every crossroads, every concealed approach the Germans tried to use. Reinhardt's Panther, the one that had mocked American pop guns on the morning of the 19th, was destroyed on the 21st by a concentration of 155 millimeters shells that turned his position into a crater field. He survived, barely, pulled from the wreckage by his crew. In the field hospital, dazed and frostbitten, he told the medic, "I have been shelled by the Russians. I have been bombed by your Air Force. But I have never seen anything like what your guns did to us. It was not a battle. It was an execution." The kill boxes grew tighter. In February 1945, during the drive to the Rhine, American artillery began using a tactic called the box. A perimeter of shell fire lay down around an enemy formation, then compressed inward like a closing fist. For batteries would establish the outer edges, firing on a precise schedule to create a wall of explosions. Then, every 3 minutes, the fire would shift inward by 50 yards. Anything inside the box had two choices: surrender or die. There was no escape, no maneuver, no hope. A German battalion caught in a box near Cologne tried to break out 3 times. Each time, they ran into the walking barrage and were shredded. By the time the firing stopped, 400 men had been killed or wounded, and the survivors stumbled forward with white flags tied to rifles. One of them, a Hauptmann who had fought since Poland, sat in the mud and wept. "This is not war," he said. "This is industrial slaughter." Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, was the mic-drop moment, the operational demonstration that the war was over even if the fighting hadn't stopped. On the night of March 23rd, over 3,000 artillery pieces opened fire in support of the river crossing. The bombardment lasted 2 hours and consumed more than 65,000 tons of shells. Every known German position within 10 kilometers of the river was targeted. Every bridge approach, every fortified building, every suspected assembly area received fire. The forward observers crossed with the first wave of infantry, radios strapped to their backs, calling corrections even as they waded through chest-deep water. One captain, coordinating fire from a partially sunken landing craft, directed a battery onto a German machine gun nest that was raking the beach. The shells landed within 30 seconds of his call. The nest vanished. His radio man looked at him, soaking wet, shivering. "Sir, how the hell do they do that?" The captain grinned, teeth chattering. "Practice, and a whole lot of Detroit." By dawn, the Americans were across. By evening, they had established a bridgehead 6 miles deep. German prisoners streamed in by the hundreds, many of them shell-shocked, some of them wounded, all of them exhausted. A lieutenant from a Volksgrenadier division, barely 20 years old, was asked by an intelligence officer how long he thought Germany could hold. He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "Hold? We are not holding. We are dying slowly, one grid square at a time. You replace everything. We replace nothing. It is mathematics now, not war." The scoreboard told a story that needed no embellishment. From June 1944 to May 1945, American artillery units in Europe fired over 30 million rounds, enough shells to fill a freight train stretching from New York to Los Angeles. The 1st Infantry Division alone expended over 500,000 rounds of 105 millimeters and 155 millimeters ammunition. A single corps, V Corps, fired more tonnage of high explosive in the Battle of the Bulge than the entire German army fired on the Western Front in the same period. The kill ratios were staggering. For every American artillery piece destroyed or disabled, German forces lost 6. For every American gunner killed, 4 German soldiers died under shell fire. The guns destroyed over 1,200 confirmed armored vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, assault guns, and disabled thousands more. They obliterated supply depots, collapsed bridges, severed communication lines, and turned entire divisions into disorganized mobs. But the numbers only captured part of the effect. The real damage was psychological. German soldiers in the final months of the war feared American artillery more than airstrikes, more than tank assaults, more than encirclement, because the shells could find you anywhere, in a foxhole, in a bunker, in a cellar, in a forest, because they came without warning and without mercy, because they never stopped. The Pacific Theater told a parallel story with different terrain and the same result. On Okinawa, American artillery dealt with Japanese bunkers carved into coral ridges and caves that laughed at anything short of a direct hit. So the gunners learned to fire at the cave mouths until the concussion alone killed everyone inside. On Luzon, the M114 howitzers shelled Japanese positions in the mountains, interdicting supply routes and collapsing defensive lines that had been prepared for months. The 105mm pack howitzers, smaller, man-portable versions, were hauled up jungle trails by hand and used to break up banzai charges before they reached American lines. A Marine Corps forward observer on Polilliu, calling fire missions from a shell crater while Japanese infantry charged his position, directed shells to within 75 yards of his own location and stopped the attack cold. His radio man asked him if he was scared. "Scared of them or scared of our own guns?" he replied. "Both, but I trust the guns more." The Japanese had no answer to this kind of firepower. Their artillery was limited, their ammunition scarce, their coordination poor. By 1945, Japanese commanders stopped trying to counter American guns and instead dug deeper, hoping to survive the bombardments and bleed the Americans in close combat. It worked occasionally. It never worked for long. The howitzers even found a role in counter-battery duels against German rocket artillery. The feared Nebelwerfer, the screaming Mimi that fired salvos of high-explosive rockets with a sound like a banshee. The Nebelwerfer was terrifying but inaccurate, and its signature scream gave away its position. American sound-ranging units, teams equipped with microphones and triangulation gear, could pinpoint a Nebelwerfer battery within seconds of its first launch. The coordinates went straight to the fire direction center. The response was typically 8 to 12 155mm howitzers converging on the German position. The Nebelwerfer crews learned to fire and displace within 60 seconds, but even that wasn't fast enough. By early 1945, entire Nebelwerfer battalions had been destroyed by counter-battery fire, and the survivors operated under strict orders. Fire once, move immediately, pray. One captured rocket artillery officer was asked why his unit had stopped firing during a critical engagement. "We were not ordered to stop," he said quietly. "We were too afraid of what would come back." The final German counteroffensive against American artillery came in the form of long-range 170mm and 210mm guns, heavy pieces that could outrange the American 155mm by several kilometers. For a brief period in late 1944, these guns caused real problems, shelling rear area positions, hitting supply dumps, forcing American batteries to displace. But the solution came swiftly. The M1 240mm howitzer, a beast of a gun that fired a 360-pound shell to a range of 23,000 yards. Only a few batteries were deployed, but their effect was immediate and final. The 240mm could reach German heavy artillery positions that were beyond the range of everything else, and when a 240mm shell landed, it didn't just destroy the target, it vaporized it. One battery of German 170mm guns near the Roer River was silenced by a single M1 240mm battery in a duel that lasted 11 minutes. The American guns fired 14 rounds. The German position ceased to exist. Prisoners captured nearby said the explosions were so large they thought the Americans were using naval guns. They weren't far wrong. The 240mm howitzer was essentially a siege weapon, a tool for breaking fortresses, repurposed for obliterating dug-in guns. It was overkill in the best possible way. In March 1945, a war correspondent embedded with the 3rd Armored Division watched an American artillery battalion set up in a captured German town. The guns were positioned in a churchyard, camouflage nets strung between headstones, ammunition stacked against the cemetery wall. The battery fired a mission, 12 rounds, target unseen. Coordinates called in by a forward observer 10 kilometers away. The shell screamed into the gray sky and disappeared. 4 minutes later, the radio man reported, "Target destroyed. Enemy armor immobilized. Good effect." The correspondent asked the battery commander how he knew the shells had hit. The commander, a captain from Iowa, just smiled. "Because we do this every day. And we never miss." The correspondent wrote in his dispatch, "The American artillery does not fight battles. It erases them." The museums are quiet now. In the fields of Belgium, a single M114 howitzer sits on a concrete pad, barrel elevated toward an empty sky. The paint is faded, the serial numbers barely legible, but the split trail carriage is still solid, the breech still functional. A plaque lists the battles: Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine, the Ruhr. It does not list the names of the men who served the gun, or the men who died under its shells. Nearby, in a small military archive in Aachen, there's a box of captured German documents, letters, orders, after-action reports. One of them, unsigned, undated, reads, "The Americans do not need to be good soldiers. They have the guns. And the guns do not miss, do not tire, and do not stop. We mocked them once. We do not mock them now." The howitzer in the field stands silent, its work long finished. But the echo of its thunder still rolls across the decades, a sound that once split the horizon, that shattered armies, that claimed the earth itself for the men who served it and the nation that built it without apology and without end. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.